Now in our last video, we talked about how parents and children work a bit more. That's going to lead into this video. So if we play our game right now and we jump on our platform, notice you can see our player kind of jittering, and then when we go down, the player's bouncing. And the reason this is happening is because every time the platform goes down, the player thinks it's falling again because it's using gravity. So we're not actually, I guess you would say, stuck to this platform as we're on it. And once we start making platforms that move in other directions, like left and right, this platform would move to the side and our player wouldn't follow it. So we need to fix this, that whenever we touch a moving platform, we kind of become part of it. And if we're not pressing anything, we move along with the platform. So that's where parenting comes in handy. So let's go back into our moving platform script. And we have all of our code here that's going to move our platform. I'm going to delete this old code now that we know we don't need it. Now to change this, we're going to use a method we used before. So just like on our rock, if we look back at our rock script, we use the onCollisionEnterToD method, and then we check if we hit the player. We want to do the exact same thing. So we can actually copy this method, and I'm going to paste it in here. And now just like this code, we also want to check if what we hit is the player. On this case, we're just debugging the message out and then destroying the game object. We don't want to do that, so let's delete this code. So just like in this line where we use this collision object that comes in and we check if it's the player. So in this case, we already know it's the player. So we can access collision.transform. And then what we want to do here is we can put .parent. And now this is going to allow us to set what the parent of that transform is. So what we want to do is set it to this object. So we can do this transform just. And remember, this needs to be transform with a lowercase, not a capital T. So what this means is if we look in our game, we go into environment, moving platforms. So if we look at this moving platform, actually this one that has the script on it. So when we say just transform, like this with a lowercase t, what we're talking about is this transform right here. So this is going to be the moving platforms transform. When we talk about transform with a capital T, so if we did something like this, what this is doing is accessing what's called the class. And I talked a bit about how, in this case, this script, moving platform, is a class. So what we're doing here is if we type transform with a capital T, this is trying to access the transform class or the script for transform. So it means it's not any specific transform in the game. When we look at an object here, like this transform here, this is an instance of transform. So remember, every object has a transform. These two transforms are completely separate from each other. Or say we take the one that's on the player, this transform here, and the moving platform transform. They both use the same class or the same script, which is called transform with a capital T, but they're their own separate object. So you can think of it again using a car analogy again. So say if you had, a Ford F-150 truck. Each one of these are Ford F-150s on the transform. So they both are created the same way. They come from the same underlying blueprints and plans of how they're created. But what happens to one truck does not happen to the other. They're completely separate from each other. That's what the difference is between when we use the uppercase or the lowercase. So if we typoed this and we did it by mistake, this is trying to access the script called transform, not the actual transform on the object. So at this point, that might not fully make sense, and we're going to expand on that as we progress as well. But I hope that gives you at least a bit more of a clear idea what the difference is here. So let's give this a try and let's watch in the hierarchy here. So we should see this player move under this one when we touch it. So let's go. Okay, and if we expand it, Now we see players under it. And notice I'm not bouncing anymore, and I can still move fine. So I can still control the player, but instead of just sitting idle in the same position, it's always going to update my position to match the platform, and then whatever I move is going to be on top of that. Now, one issue here is obviously if we jump, we're still on that platform. So if I jump off, notice I'm still a child of that platform. And you can notice I'm jittering. This is because every time the platform moves, it's trying to move my player, but that's almost fighting with the Unity physics system because physics are controlling how I move. So you can see as it goes up, it moves the player up a bit, and then gravity brings me down and I jitter. So that's one big bug. Let me show you the other one here. If we run it again. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of these rocks. Now notice if I touch the side of the platform, it's going to child me to it there too. So I will still fall, but I'm a child. I should only be a child if we hit it from the top. So that's one bug. Let's fix the first issue. So what we need to do is just like on collision enter 2D, we want to use on collision exit 2D. We're going to do the same check. We want to check if it's our player that exited. And if it is, what we want to do with the transform parent, instead of saying equal to this transform, what we want to put in here is just null. And what null means is it's not going to set the parent to anything. So if we look back in our hierarchy, notice this is the top level. So if we say null and the player has no parent, it's going to go back to this top level where it is right now. So let's test this out now. Okay, so I'm on the platform, everything's smooth and nice, and I jump off, and we see our players back to the top level, and I'm not attached to it. I can go back on. We're all good. Okay, so that's working. Now we do have one bug with this, that if we hit the platform from the side, we still get attached to it. We should only do that if we land on top of it. So that's something that we're going to fix in another video, but for now we at least have an object that's going to attach to our platform and we can move with them. In this video, we're going to make it so our player can start detecting what the ground is and when it's on top of it. So currently we have two problems that this is going to address. Firstly, when we're running the game, we can endlessly jump. So if we're up in the air, we can keep jumping. And then the other issue is if we touch the platform from the sides, we shouldn't be parented to it because we only want that when we land on top. Now this is a bit more of a complex task to achieve, so we're going to break it down into a few separate steps, and I'm going to try to explain each one as we go. So the first thing is we need a point at the player's feet that we're going to use to check. So the first thing, let's go on our player. I'm just going to right click, create an empty child. I'm just going to call this ground check. Now if I use the move tool by pressing W on the keyboard, I can move this empty object wherever I want down here. So I'm going to put it very close to the bottom of the player's feet. So right about here. And we don't actually see anything at that position, so it's just kind of lining it up the best you can. It doesn't have to be perfect on this. And one other thing we can do with it, so if we click this little icon here on the inspector for the game object, we can give it an icon. So I'm just going to give it a green diamond here. Now you don't see it while it's selected, but if we unselect our player, now we see a green diamond here. So this is pretty big. We can change the size of this if we select our gizmos drop down here. And then 3D icons, we can change it so the icons aren't so big. Now this is just temporary. I'm going to show you another way that we can draw something here in the next video. So for now, we're just using this here. So I'm going to move this a little bit up, I think. Just a tiny bit. But again, it doesn't have to be perfect, so that's fine. We just want an empty object right there. Now let's go back into our player controller script. So now we need to get a reference to that ground check object. So just like we did in the camera controller, where we got a transform for the player, we're going to do something similar here. So I'm going to make a serialized field variable, and it's going to be of type transform. And I'm just going to call this ground check transform, just so it's very clear what it is. Now when we go back and select our player, we have this option here, so we can just drag this object right in. And now what I'm going to do is scroll up, and I'm going to apply these overrides to the prefab. So you can see right now ground check is white under player because it's not added to the prefab yet. So just in case we want to make any changes later or add another player, let's apply that. So that's the first step completed. Now the next step is we don't know what ground is. So let's open our environment. I'm going to look at platforms. And if we just select this platform, remember we set its layer to be ground. So this platform does have a way to tell objects that it's ground by using the layer. So now we need to find a way in our player of knowing what that ground is. We can do this by using what's called a layer mask. So we've talked a little bit about layers and layer masks previously. The main spot we've used it so far is on our light, where we had to add the layers in that we want to check. So this target sorting layers dropdown is a layer mask, where it allows us to select and deselect certain layers. So we're going to create our own inside of the player controller. So let's go back to the player controller, and right under this one, we can do another serialized field because we want it to show up in the inspector. It's going to be type layer mask. And what's really common for this is people will usually call it what is ground. So now if we go back into our game, on our player, we now have this drop down that says what is ground. If we click on this, we can select the ground layer. We can actually go in and we can select many layers. So currently we don't want to do that, but say if later we have another layer we want to be able to consider ground, we can add that. For instance, say if you had a power up that lets you walk on water, you could use that when you have the power up enabled. But for right now, all we want is ground. Okay, so that's the second step. We now know what the ground is, and we have a position we want to check for the ground, but now we have to do the actual check. So for this part, I'm going to make a variable of type bool. I'm going to call it is grounded. And by default, we're just going to set it to false. Now in update, we're going to want to check if we're grounded. So what I'm going to do so we don't start cluttering up update here is I'm going to make our own little method. So I'm just going to make one here. We're going to use type void, and let's just call it ground check. Now what I want to do is in update, I want to call ground check every single frame. So let's just do that right now. So it's going to start calling ground check every frame. So we want to take our is grounded variable, and we need to find a way to tell if we're touching the ground. So now there's something built into Unity that can do this for us. So I'm going to bring up the documentation page here. In the physics 2D system, we have something called overlap circle. And now here for the description, it says checks if a collider falls within a circular area. So what this does is it's going to draw a circle. It's not actually going to draw it. It's just going to create a circle around a point that we tell it. And then we're going to tell it what layers we want to check and consider ground. So it's going to draw a circle in the back end of the physics system. And inside that circle, it's going to look to see if anything has the layer that we tell it to. If it does, it's going to return true. And if it doesn't, it's going to return false. So this is perfect for what we want to do. So we want to use physics 2D, and then we want overlap circle. And now the first thing we have to tell it is where to start the circle from, the center of it. So that's our ground check transform, and then dot position. Now the next thing we have to tell it how big to make the circle with the radius. So if we look here, this is where we're checking. We want it very small because we only want to check right around here. If we did a bigger one, we might catch something on the right or left side, or even if it was too far over and the player should fall instead of walk. So we just want something very small right under the player. So this comes down to play testing. So for starting, I'm thinking we're going to try maybe like 0.25 and we'll see how that works. Now the next thing, you can see the autocomplete's trying to help us here. The next thing it needs is a layer mask. So we already have the layer mask up here. What is ground? Okay, and that's all we need to do to get a check if we're actually on the ground or not. So what I'm going to do, just so we can test this out, let's make this serialized as well. So let's put serialized field. Now the reason I'm doing this is so we can see it in the inspector. So now we see a checkbox for is grounded. Okay, so now if I run the game, by default it's unchecked. Now I hit the ground and it's checked. If I jump, it's unchecked. I can still do the multiple jumps because we didn't put any code in for that yet. And if I land on the platform, it's grounded. So we're very close to what we need now. All we need to do is let's go into our player controller and update where we have jump. Inside of jump, we can do a check. We can say if is grounded. And we can do is grounded equals true. So now this is only going to run if the jump button is pressed first, and then it's going to check if it's grounded. If it's true, it'll let us jump. Let's test it out and see if this works. Okay, so I can only jump once. Okay, and let's go make sure we can jump on our moving platform, and we can. And one thing to test, if I keep hitting the jump button, you can notice sometimes I'll jump before I hit the ground again. So it's hard to hit, it doesn't always work, but sometimes it did, like there. And that's because of how far we set the radius for this. So that means it's a bit too big. So maybe I'll try 1.5 or 0.15. And this is where playtesting comes in. You're going to tweak this as we progress through our game and make sure it works however you want it to. But right now we have this working, and we can actually clean this code up a little bit better here. So the first thing I've shown before, this comparison is either going to be true or false. So we're doing is grounded equals true, which means is grounded equals true. But is grounded is already a Boolean value, so it's either true or false. So we don't need this because we can just use is grounded. This is already going to be either true or false. But to clean it up even a bit better, let's just cut this. I'm going to delete this. We'll put it back. We can do it all in one if statement here. So where we have our input checking if jump was pressed. So we can add multiple comparisons into one if statement here. So if we put the and symbol, the ampersand, twice, this allows us to put a second comparison here. So now I could say and is grounded equals true. And as I just mentioned, because it's already a Boolean, we can just remove the equals true, and we can just say if input.getButton down jump and is grounded, then do this. So both of these have to be true for this code to run. If either of them is false, this is not going to happen. And another one we could do here, we don't need it in this case, but if we use the pipe symbol, so you press that twice, this is the OR operator. So it works in a similar way, but it says OR. So what this will do is this will say if input.getButton jump is pressed or is grounded is true, then do this. So in this case, that doesn't work. We want to use the ands, but I just wanted to show you it now. Okay, so let's just test this code and make sure it works. Okay, so I can only jump once, and now I can't jump from as far. And just to demonstrate it, here, if we jump on the boulders, we can't jump off of them. Now we still stick to the objects you saw there. We'll fix that in a future video as well. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one.